Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I've been getting requests for me to take a look at this particular video for probably a couple of years now. It is the U.S. presidents ranked by Michael Knowles. Now, I'm going to acknowledge up front, and this is going to seem strange to some of you, I have not the first clue about Michael Knowles. I know he exists. I know he's some kind of a political commentator. I don't even know which side he is on in all of that. I know a lot of you are very familiar with that, but I intentionally avoid those kinds of channels and those kinds of commentators in general because it just frustrates and depresses me on either side. So it'll be interesting to take a look and see how he ranks the presidents, and I will definitely offer my agreements and disagreements where appropriate, and it'll give us a chance to kind of talk and look at these presidents from different point of view. I've obviously done my own two-part video series ranking the presidents a couple years ago, and I'll put a link down in the description so you can check that out if you haven't previously seen it. The link will be there as well for this one. It's going to be really interesting because, like I said, I don't even know where he's coming from with all this. It'll be interesting to see what his biases are and see if they're the same or different than mine, and we'll have a good time talking about what we agree and disagree with. I want to thank David, who just signed up as an executive producer level patron. Thank you so much, David. Your name will be reflected at the end screen in the very near future. I could not do this without people like you who show so much support for this channel. Thank you so much. Let's dive in.
With a foggy-headed marionette in the Oval Office, I figured now
okay, I guess I know what side he's on.
Time than just about ever to give out a definitive ranking of the presidents. You know, other people, they'll say this is S tier and this is F tier. We have different categories. For the top tier, the S tier, we have King Arthur, the ideal leader. At the next level, right below
So somebody who, at least our version of King Arthur, never existed. Got it.
That, where you can really show, you know, you got some goulions.
Oh, the language on you.
You know, you're really tough. Maybe you're not quite the top, but you're pretty good. King Leonidas,
who was 60 years old at the time. Another guy who existed, but the idea we have of him, not real.
In the third tier, kind of middle of the road, some good stuff, but a little bit weak, you've got King Mufasa. The level below that, now things are getting pretty bad, you have King Lear. And then at the lowest tier, we of course have the Burger King level of Commander-in-Chief.
Who is super creepy, by the way. Do you remember, I mean, some of you have to remember this, that when they first introduced the Burger King character, and there were like these video, like commercials where he would like be standing behind a tree and he'd peek out. It was terrifying.
Categories. Arthur, Leonidas, Mufasa, Lear, and Burger.
So 5 tiers.
Before we begin, this video is sponsored by Ring. No matter your home, Ring has everything you need to protect it. More from them in a minute. Now, let's get started. I'm going to try to get through at least half of the presidents and give them the definitive ranking. Let's begin with...
I don't understand this whole, like, rank the presidents, but don't rank all of them. Like, yeah, other tier lists I've looked at have done the same thing. Like, they only rank some of them. That's weird.
Numero uno, George Washington. George Washington, first president of the United States, no question whatsoever, he is King Arthur.
I agree.
He may actually be the reincarnation of King Arthur. The indispensable man, loved lots of the founding fathers. He was the best among them. Without George Washington, there would not be a United States of America.
I agree with that. I've talked before about my criticisms of him as a tactical commander on a battlefield, but otherwise, great leader, and I agree with him. There is no United States as we know it, and there's no presidency as we know it without George Washington.
I'm pretty confident to say. So he's the one, he gets the top spot, no surprise there. Next up, John Adams, the second president of the United States. He was less commanding, perhaps, than George Washington, but he was still really, really great. I'm going to give him Leonidas.
I get the feeling like maybe he doesn't actually know much about John Adams' presidency. John Adams has a lot of great qualities, and as a founding father, super important. Honestly, his presidency is about the worst part of his career. Alien and Sedition Acts, terrible. You know, a lot of black marks on his presidency, but some good things too. Kept us out of war, kept us neutral at a time when it would have been very easy to jump in, for example, on the side of the French. And there was a lot of pressure for him to do that. make sure that we get the start of a Navy, which was really important. And I mean, following up George Washington's like a no-win scenario anyway, but I'd put him mid at best. There's no way he's up that high.
Okay, he's right below that top tier. Like Leonidas, he lost, right? So he won one term, but then he lost to Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800. The other thing I really like about John Adams, other than he was a conservative and a real conservative, he defended the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre because he felt that they were in the right and that the
I don't know that he felt they were in the right. I think you're applying a little bit too much to him there. He just felt that it was right that they have a fair trial. It was all about his convictions, and his convictions were that, even in this scenario, especially in this scenario, these British soldiers need to have a fair trial. And I do believe that they were innocent of what they were charged with under the circumstances, and maybe he felt that way too. But I don't know if I would say he felt they were in the right.
The press had been covering this was not fair. But then, of course, he was one of the great patriots in the Revolution. So really fair-minded, very conservative. He had an acid tongue. He once said of Alexander Hamilton, who was a member of Adams's own party, that he was the bastard bat of a Scotch peddler, and there were not enough
bastard brat, yeah.
Whores in Philadelphia.
He also called him Creole bastard at one point.
To contain his superabundance of secretions. So that's pretty terrific diction. He'll get that Leonidas level. Next up, Thomas Jefferson, the man who beat John Adams. I'm going to give Jefferson, he gets Leonidas too. He's not quite King Arthur because some of his ideas were a little kooky, but this is also the reason why Jefferson gets such a high ranking, is he talked like a big lib. If you read a lot of what Jefferson wrote, he really sounded kind of like a lib. However, he behaved in many ways like a conservative. He expanded the United States. He was a great defender of liberal education.
Honestly, I mean, if you compare his politics, and I don't mean on specific issues, because it's really hard to compare guys from different eras on specific issues, but his view on government, for example, which is really what defines Thomas Jefferson, he really is a modern-day Republican. States' rights, strong state government versus weaker federal government, although modern Republicans also have some ways in which they very much view for a strong central government, too. So it's kind of a mixed thing. But I think of the two parties today, he would certainly be more likely to be a Republican.
Liberal in the good sense of that word, even though he kind of weakened it a little bit, founded the University of Virginia. All around, really, really impressive guy. So, okay, he's up there with Leonidas.
I'm not a fan of Jefferson, as I've expressed many times before. I just don't like him personally, and there's a lot of things about his character that I'm not a fan of. But I can't see a scenario in which John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's presidencies are ranked on the same tier. I mean, Jefferson's clearly above John Adams.
Andrew Jackson.
So we skipped.
President of the United States.
I get the feeling here, like, does he just not know much about the president? So he's just kind of covering the big, well-known ones? Is that kind of what's going on here?
Everyone wants me to say Burger King level. Or at the very best, he's a Mufasa type. Or a King Lear. No. Andrew Jackson also gets Leonidas level. I know, they're going to call me a racist or a sexist or a thisist or a thatist. Oh, Andrew Jackson, he was mean to the Indians or something.
Honestly, most presidents at that point were white supremacist, racist by modern standards. So honestly, while I'm not saying we should dismiss their views on those things, I think it's really hard to judge them solely on that and say, oh, well, it doesn't matter what else they did because racist. We got to go a little deeper than that. Which,
frankly, was actually his successor, who was far meaner to the Indians. But let's not forget, Andrew Jackson fought wars. He was a war hero, not just against the Indians.
But I'm not sure how much that has to do with his presidency.
Against the British. He was the hero of New Orleans. When it comes to the Indian Wars, by the way, for the people who want to say that he was a big racist or something like that, he actually adopted an Indian child who had been orphaned. So I don't think he harbored any kind of personal bigotry. He was a man of and for the people.
It's complicated, and I think there might be something to that, to talk about Jackson not necessarily having any personal, hatred or bigotry. It was really more of a United States supremacy. It was kind of a nationalism, that anything that got in the way of the U.S. supremacy over the territory, and if that included the Native Americans who were trying to have their own governments within that territory, then move them out, right? I think it's complicated. I wouldn't come right out and say he wasn't bigoted at all, but I don't know that he was any more bigoted than anybody else of that era.
Demonstrated great courage. He was also against the kind of bureaucratized government, the professional administrative class. He was really against that.
Yeah, he's the founder of the modern Democratic Party. It's Jacksonian Democrats. And, I mean, last time the U.S. Actually was debt-free was under Jackson.
A little bit of populism. I think this is why Trump liked Jackson so much. So I don't care. He founded the Democrat Party. Okay, whatever, that's fine. He still gets Leonidas tier for me.
I wouldn't put him that high. If we're talking 5 tiers, I mean, I wish we had more than 5 tiers. If we had 6 tiers, I'd probably put him in tier 3, maybe. I don't know. I remember how I ranked him at the time.
Necessary national policies, and had the courage to do it. Next up, William Henry Harrison. Most people don't think about that.
So we're going to skip Monroe and Madison and John Quincy Adams, but we're going to go to the guy who was president for a month.
Harrison was the shortest presidency that we've ever had. Harrison was president for exactly 1 month. So he can't be King Arthur. He didn't make it that long. He can't be Leonidas, really. But I'll give him. Gosh, should I give him Leonidas too?
N.A.
No, that's a little too much. I'll give him Mufasa.
You can't even rank him. He wasn't president long enough to have any kind of an impact on the presidency. His biggest contribution to the presidency was helping us figure out what to do when a president dies in office, because it's going to happen a bunch more times.
That kind of Mufasa tier. The reason I really like him, though, is, first of all, he's the hero of Tippecanoe. He was
we're ranking them on their lives. That has nothing to do with his presidency.
Good, strong American military leader. And he didn't like that he was being insulted on the campaign trail. He didn't like that people were saying he'd lost a step or two. So for his inauguration, he went out it was a rainy, cold day, and he gave a 2-hour-long speech.
It's not why he died.
All around me are familiar faces.
And they had already trimmed it down. He gave a 2-hour-long speech in the cold and in the rain. He then attended multiple inauguration parties, and he just went out. He really did it up, and then he took sick and he died. Sure.
It's not why he got sick. There's no connection, no clear connection between his inauguration and being out in the rain and the cold and him dying. He was actually okay for a couple of weeks and then got sick
Thereafter. But you got to give him credit for the gumption. A lot of courage. So
I do give him credit for that. I think he did really well at trying to disprove those ideas that he was old and tired. But then he died in office anyway.
Good on him. Next up, Abraham Lincoln, 16th president.
Wow, so we're skipping all of the really bad ones that were in there in the middle.
United States. He is the only president, I think, who could vie with Washington for that King Arthur level, because his mind was so capacious. He was,
Put Theodore
he was
Roosevelt
such a
up there,
symbol
too.
of the American dream, the American idea. A guy rose up from nothing, very serious, had studied.
People don't realize, I say this all the time, but I can't emphasize it enough, what an absolutely brilliant politician Abraham Lincoln was. This guy, I think more than any other person who's ever held the office of president, understood how the game was played and played it nearly flawlessly.
Shakespeare and the King James Bible, that was what made up the bulk of his education. He did try toward nobility throughout his entire life, and where he fell short, he at least was always trying. He was really striving for self-improvement, held the country together, and in that sense, refounded the nation after the Civil War. So he gets up there with King Arthur.
Yeah.
Next up, James Garfield, 20th president.
I really don't understand. He's skipping some really prominent presidents. I know I'm harping on this, but then he's parking on the presidents who had like the least impact, like Harrison and then Garfield. Garfield's the second shortest term of any president
of the United States. Everybody forgets James Garfield. He also died shortly after he was brought into office. He died, I think he was assassinated. Could be wrong about that. He might have just taken sick and died. But
Wait, he didn't even know that Listen, if you if you are going to advertise at the beginning of your video that this is the definitive list ranking presidents, and then you don't even know how James Garfield died in office, you're not giving me a great deal of confidence in your rankings.
Anyway, that's not why I'm interested in Garfield. Garfield, I guess, would get a Mufasa level. He wasn't super duper impressive, except that he published the first blank book in American history.
The Magnificent.
This was called The Political Achievements and Statesmanship of General Hancock, regular Democratic nominee for president. It was 5 blank pages. The first blank book in American history was Republicans trolling Democrats in the 1880 presidential election. For that alone, he has to at least rank,
I mean, he's right. Listen, I'm a fan of Winfield Scott Hancock, great general, great leader during the American Civil War. But obviously politics is politics, and so you've got these two guys who are both generals, but Garfield has this long history in politics. He's been in Congress for a decade and a half at this point, and has a lot more to run on than Hancock does. But Garfield did some good things. I mean, he was working in the right direction, dealing with the spoils system, dealing with corruption in government. Brilliant man, probably one of the most intelligent people who have ever held the office of president. Just wasn't there long enough to make a long-term impact.
Middle tier, if not a little bit higher. Next up, the vice president to James Garfield, who became president upon his death, who published the second blank book in American history in the next presidential election. That would be Chester A. Arthur, a highly, highly underrated president. Chester Arthur had a very strong record. He was good on matters of civil rights. He was a relatively modest president. He was relatively...
I don't know. Dude loved to change his outfits like multiple times a day and always wanted to look really fancy. He certainly could have been modest, but that part of his character wasn't modest.
Humble. Republicans right now, by the way, can learn something from Chester Arthur in the way that he handled the immigration question. Because, Republicans have this thing where we want to have national borders. We want to control who gets to come into the country. We want there to be national unity. Of course, every country wants
to. So he's saying we, so obviously he identifies himself as a Republican.
Do that. But in the United States, if you say that you want to enforce very basic laws of immigration, you're called a racist. That's racist! And Chester Arthur, there was a big immigration law that came up during his presidency in 1882, and he vetoed the first version of the bill because he felt that it would have been punitive and violated some treaties. And so he sent it back, and then there was another bill that came to his desk, which was, a little bit more moderate in its immigration policies, and he signed that one into law. So you can be tough on it without, falling into bigotry or racism.
I think he makes a good point there. There is a way to go about the immigration question by enforcing your borders and enforcing your laws, but also not doing it in such a way that obviously there are always going to be some people who basically want the opposite of that, who want open borders, who want anybody to be able to come in who wants to, and that's fine if that's how you feel, who are going to spin things any way that they can, but there's still a way to go about it without seeming bigoted or without intentionally targeting certain groups of people.
Or something like that. It was moderate. Moderation is a virtue, but it was strong in the sense that it did enforce national borders and assimilate new immigrants who would come in and maintain that national unity. Great stuff, Chester Arthur. He does not get enough credit.
So I will say this about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the bill he's talking about. It's hard to argue that it doesn't come across as bigoted when it was specifically targeting one group of immigrants. It was really the first law in American history that restricted immigration, and it was a 10-year ban on anyone immigrating from China. This is especially true in the West. There was a lot of Chinese immigration happening. A lot of like the common theme with when people talk about illegal immigration today is a lot of Chinese people coming in, offering cheap labor and taking our jobs, that kind of thing, is what was happening there.
People forget about him, but he really did a good job, took over after Garfield.
And I think Arthur did some really good things, again, related to what Garfield was focused on, which was dealing with the spoils system, dealing with corruption in government and cronyism, things like that.
I guess I'll put him I'll put him at Mufasa level 2. Some interesting reforms under him. Next up, Grover Cleveland. I'm not saying I love Grover Cleveland. He was a big Dem. But he has the distinction of being...
Yeah, but he was very conservative, which I would think somebody on the Republican side would be in favor of. You know, you got to ignore the party labels because the parties are constantly changing. They didn't switch. There's not just a party switch that magically happened one day. The parties are constantly evolving. What the parties look like today is not what they looked like 20 years ago, 40, 60, 80 years ago. We're constantly undergoing these party system changes. And he was conservative. And I mean, by today's standards, he would probably be a Republican.
Being the 22nd and the 24th president. He is the only president who won non-consecutive terms. So
at
good
the time,
on him for that. You got
no longer the case.
Give him some credit. He's at least a Mufasa. I think we'll give him a Mufasa. You want to give him that Leonidas because he was just so tough that he went and got that second term, but I'll give him the Mufasa.
I don't know. It seems like a pretty petty thing to judge someone's presidency on. I went into more detail on all of these presidents in my own tier ranking, so I just wish he would go a little deeper here.
And then we get to very possibly the worst president in the history of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, 28th president. Woodrow Wilson only became president, by the way, because Teddy Roosevelt wanted to come back into power, so he split the conservatives who would have been voting for his successor,
They weren't conservatives, though. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was a progressive. Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive. Taft said he was a progressive. Everybody was kind of progressive at this point. It was just degrees of progressivism. But I mean, are we just not going to rank Theodore Roosevelt, I guess?
Taft, and that by splitting the right gave Woodrow Wilson a way to enter the White House and destroy our country. Wilson is the most consciously progressive president in American history. He said that the old constitutional government is outdated. It's based on the laws of Isaac Newton and a fixed universe and permanent human nature. So you got to ditch all that. We're living in the age of Darwin, baby. Everything's evolving.
We're using the power of rock and roll to change the world. Woo!
We need to let government bureaucrats just run the whole country absent any accountability to the people. He just ruined everything, just about. Everyone always goes after Wilson for being a racist. Like, sure, that's bad, but when you consider the list of the horrible things this guy did, I don't even know if it's on the first 3 pages.
It definitely is in the first couple of pages because he resegregated the federal government and he really set things back. And he empowered the Klan to come back in a big way.
That's how bad his presidency was. He's going to be King Lear.
You going to give any specifics? I mean, obviously, coming from the conservative side, he's going to say things like the Federal Reserve, the permanent income tax, but some of this stuff really probably happens anyway. Like women's suffrage is going to happen either way, and rightfully so. I don't know.
The reason he's not all the way down at Burger King is because he really did die kind of mad and furious and ripping his hair out. Because finally, after he had almost thoroughly destroyed the country, the Senate refused to go along with his stupid at that time, the League of Nations plan, so they wouldn't sign on to it, and he was really upset by that, and he died from the stress. So.
Okay, so you said he's the worst president in American history, but you didn't put him in your lowest tier.
But, kind of like Lear, he's just screaming and yelling, "Blow, wind, crack your cheeks." Next up, Warren Harding. Oh, Warren Harding, that guy's at least a Mufasa. He is. Everyone thinks he's a Burger King. Everyone says, oh, Harding, he's one of the worst presidents in American history. Very, very underrated president. When he died in office...
I could hear that argument being made. He was only president for 2.5 years. But I've heard other people make the argument that he's underrated as a president. And I think a lot of it gets overshadowed, much like Nixon, because of the corruption. I think, there's several presidents we look at and we think we see their presidency through the corruption. Grant's corruption was not him personally, but people in his administration. Harding's and Nixon's much more them involved. But it makes it difficult to fairly judge their presidency because we see everything through the lens of their corruption.
He was one of the most popular presidents in the history of the country.
He was very popular.
He was really strong on various matters, how do I put this? I sound like I'm Donald Trump. He was really strong on the thing, the thing. They always...
Yeah, that's about your extent of presidential knowledge, it seems.
try to hit him on Teapot Dome. This was this scandal for Harding.
It was bad.
That, there was some moderate sort of corruption. That was just a way to distract from. He had a very good record. He was very...
Teapot Dome was a legit scandal, and he was legit in the middle of it. Let's not ignore it and act like it was nothing, and it was just a political distraction.
Popular. He was serving the interests of the people. He was a modest reformer. I give him Mufasa. Next up, Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal.
He's going to rate him high.
Last of his breed. Gotta love.
The last of his breed, indeed. And I think that, honestly, if I'm looking back at the other presidents that he has talked about so far, the president probably most closely aligned with Calvin Coolidge would be Grover Cleveland in terms of being a more hands-off, more caretaker, less interventionist in terms of his policies as president.
Of Silent Cal. I would put him at a Leonidas level. The reason I put him at a Leonidas level is he was so deferential to the American tradition. He was so reverent toward George Washington. He was so modest in his own personal comportment. He really stood firm with this changing tide where you were going to get...
I agree. And you got to remember, he's coming in at a time when it's been all about progressivism. And on both parties, Republicans and Democrats, have been very progressive at this point. And he takes a step back from that. He doesn't go out of his way to try and undo progressivism, but he just comes in and just kind of is, right? He's just kind of there, and he's just kind of not rocking the boat, not going to move the ball forward, not going to take it back, just going to kind of keep the ship steady in the direction that it's going. And I admire that.
Yet more and more of a sort of aggressive celebrity presidency. He stood firm against that. Silent Cal. He was good. Only president to ever shrink the government. Next up, Franklin Roosevelt. 32nd president.
So we're going to skip Herbert Hoover.
United States. This one kills me because on the one hand, he's the most effective president we've ever had. He was a king. He made himself a king, whereas someone like Calvin Coolidge would rather leave office than stay in office longer than George Washington. Roosevelt, he wanted to stay there 4 terms. He would have stayed there longer had he not died. Roosevelt just utterly upending the country, implementing the sort of government that Woodrow Wilson had designed.
Yeah, that's true. I will say this about Roosevelt. I don't give him too much flack for the 4-term thing. There was nothing in the Constitution that prevented him from running for 4 terms. It was a tradition set by George Washington. But there was no law that he was violating. There is now, because of him, that we've passed it and made it a constitutional amendment. But I'm not going to knock him for playing within the rules as far as elections go.
So he was ruthlessly effective. But it was all bad. So should he rank really high up on the list?
Call
or
it
really
all
low?
bad. I would say that there needed to be some government intervention. Did he take it too far? And did we need to continue those things after we had recovered is the question. But I think at the time he was very proactive, and it needed to be to a degree. Obviously, we can knock him for internment of Japanese Americans during the war in camps, which obviously was very bad. But definitely more positives than negatives, and I'm not going to rank Roosevelt down at the bottom just because he had liberal policies.
He is the Burger King. Not because he was...
So you say Woodrow Wilson was the worst president in American history, but you rank Franklin Roosevelt below him.
Joke, not because he was incompetent. Burger King's a very successful company. But because he was no King Arthur. Let's put it that way. Next up, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was a Republican.
Truman.
He was a war hero, but he was kind of a lib.
Let's get busy.
This is the problem. This is really tough. So I guess...
By what standard was he a lib? I don't know. He's got a really weird view on who's conservative and who's liberal throughout history.
I'd give him Mufasa level. Maybe his heart was in the right place. Maybe he was trying to do good stuff, but he ultimately was not particularly successful. He, in many ways, accelerated the liberalization of America.
What was he not successful at? This is a really strange take on Eisenhower.
This is why William F. Buckley Jr., when he founded the sort of post-war conservative movement, he was pretty cool to Ike. They wanted a more conservative candidate. Eisenhower much more from the liberal wing of the party. On the flip side...
I mean, he was from the more liberal wing of the Republican Party, but I mean, he was a moderate. He was not a liberal by any stretch of the imagination. Just as John F. Kennedy then was from the more conservative part. I mean, there were certainly liberal aspects to him as well, but he, compared to an FDR or a Woodrow Wilson, was not nearly as liberal as they were.
Side of that, you have John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was from the more conservative wing, anti-communist.
Yes, but he was still more liberal than Eisenhower was. So I don't get where he's going with this.
Wing of the Democratic Party. Now, I'm not one of these people that idolizes Kennedy. He is fine. He wasn't president for very long.
I like your funny words, Magic Man.
Clone High. Oh my gosh, my daughter loves that show.
I would probably rank him, though, at a Leonidas level.
It's very strange to me that he's not even consistent with his own rankings. The worst president in American history is not the lowest ranked president on his list, according to him. A liberal Republican is ranked lower than a conservative Democrat, even though that conservative Democrat was more liberal than the liberal Republican, according to him. I don't know.
The reason I would put him at Leonidas is, he was a lib, and in his personal life, he was a bit of a degenerate. But he was a staunch anti-communist.
So was Eisenhower. Eisenhower absolutely was.
He loved Joseph McCarthy. Actually, John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, went to Joe McCarthy's funeral.
I don't know that that's a positive. I mean, you could be anti-communist, but still not support how McCarthy went about it. And I don't know anybody who looks back on Joe McCarthy and says, man, what a great time in American history that was when we were doing the Red Scare and we were hunting down communists left and right in our own country.
That's how much the Kennedys loved McCarthy. He was the most toughest anti-communist crusader we had. So I'll give him Leonidas for that. And then, unfortunately, the communists took him out. Next up is LBJ. LBJ, also, he's another one like FDR. LBJ, 36th president, pushed through the Great Society, radically upended our culture and our political system, and really, in a way, sort of.
How do you radically upend the culture? I'm curious to know what he means by that. I can see people on the left saying that that's a dog whistle for racism and that he empowered black people and things like that because of the Civil Rights Act. And I don't know if that's what he meant by that. I don't want to assume that. But I wish he would flesh that out a little bit. What do you mean by upended the culture?
Founded the country in terms of the legal and political upheavals during his reign. So very, very effective, great at amassing power. If you read the biography of LBJ by Robert Caro, you see that this guy is as dishonest as they come. This guy was stealing elections back in college. He stole an election for his little staff club when he was working on the Hill. He certainly stole that 1948 Senate election in Texas, which is how he then became senator, vice president, and then president after Kennedy died. So the effect of LBJ, pretty weak stuff. I would put him at the Lear level because also by the time he ran for re-election.
So basically you have three of the most progressive presidents in American history ranked at the bottom. So it's pretty consistent with his own politics.
Or wanted to run for re-election. He couldn't. The popularity was not there. Next up, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is a tragic case because in many ways he was a terrific president. He was one of the great political figures of his age.
But he was the vice president under Eisenhower and very much in the same vein of Eisenhower as a moderate Republican.
Nixon always wins.
He was basically the only person who believed Whittaker Chambers when Whittaker Chambers said that there are commies in the government.
It's so weird whenever I hear Whittaker Chambers' name because my grandmother who raised me, her father was a Whittaker and her mother was a Chambers, so I don't know.
To and including Alger Hiss, who helped found the UN at the State Department. Guys like Harry Dexter White at Treasury. Everyone said, oh, you're crazy, this is conspiratorial. No way, all the libs tried to downplay it. But no, there were commies throughout the U.S. government who were taking direct orders from Moscow and who were serving as Soviet spies. So Nixon knew it, he caught it, they never forgave him for it. They never forgave him for taking down Alger Hiss. That's why there were so many shenanigans in 1960, and that's why the deep state stole the election from him, or rather stole the presidency from him after he won re-election later on. However, Nixon let his paranoia run away with him.
Yeah.
He made some crucial political mistakes.
He did.
and he went down because of it. I'm not saying it was fair. But
right, and well, it's fair in that he made his own choices. I mean, he had no one to blame for that but himself.
Probably went down a little bit like King Lear. Too bad, because if not for that, I'm torn. He's either a King Lear or a Leonidas.
I agree from the standpoint that, as I said earlier, it's too bad that he let his own paranoia get in the way, because I think that otherwise he was a pretty effective president and very intelligent. When I talked about Garfield being one of our most intelligent presidents, I put Nixon up there as well. If you ever watch interviews with Nixon later on post-presidency, super smart guy, really understood things well, and very articulate in explaining them, but unfortunately got in his own way.
He's one of the two. It just depends on kind of what part of his career you're going to focus on. So you know what? Because I want to take a more positive view of Nixon, I'll give him the Leonidas thing.
But I don't understand the inconsistency between feeling Nixon was so good and the opposite about Eisenhower, because I feel like they were both kind of in the same vein of the Republican Party.
But he did go down, so in some ways he's kind of like King Lear. Make of that what you will. Jimmy Carter, Burger King. Done. That's it. It's easy. Ronald Reagan.
He's going to put him at the top.
40th President of the United States. Really terrific. He's a Leonidas. He's not quite a King Arthur. I love Reagan, but he's not quite a King Arthur. But he was great. He understood what was going on. He stood firm. He won the Cold War. He had a clear view of the world. His legacy has been tarnished by a bunch of squishes who pretend to speak for him, and they call themselves Reaganites.
No, his legacy is tarnished by things that are rightfully judged to be bad. I mean, Iran-Contra, how he initially handled the AIDS crisis, not that others would have done much better. I think maybe we're a little unfair with him in that, but he certainly didn't handle it well. Folks criticize his economic policies, although I don't have a big problem with those. So I think that we have a pretty balanced view on Reagan to this day, and I think I'd put him around that 10 to 12 range, like not quite top 10, but just outside of it.
But they're not really. Reagan was a lot tougher than people give him credit for. Next up, George H.W. Bush. He's Mufasa, I guess. I'm being generous, I think, to George H.W. Bush. You know, he was an admirable guy. He lived an admirable life. He was from the liberal wing of the Republican Party, but upright guy.
Again, I don't think he was liberal. I mean, by that point, the Republican Party didn't really nominate people for the presidency who were liberal. He was more moderate than Reagan, certainly.
At the end of the Cold War, when he could have been really tough, when he could have really focused on the challenges that we had, he basically embraced a kind of liberal internationalism. So the Cold War had roiled the United States for the latter part of the 20th century. We win it. Reagan wins it. The Berlin Wall comes down. And George H.W. Bush, instead of focusing on the cultural new Cold War that was going on in the United States, he just...
Berlin Wall came down, by the way, during Bush's presidency, I'm pretty sure, not Reagan's.
Decided to look abroad, and it famously used...
Obviously, Reagan's policies had a lot to do with that.
Saw this when, in the 1992 Republican nominating convention, there were two candidates. Pat Buchanan, who was the social conservative, and George...
Psychotic social conservative. You want to talk about all the stuff we're seeing from people like Daryl Cooper and the Zoomer historian when it comes to this revisionist... Hitler really wasn't the bad guy. Winston Churchill was the real evil person in World War II. It comes from Pat Buchanan. He's the one that wrote that stuff and espoused those views that are now being spouted by people like that.
George H.W. Bush, who was the liberal Republican. And in the speeches, Buchanan gave the famous culture war speech, which I talk about in my book, Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. And George H.W. Bush talked about how the real fight now is to just make a lot of money. And we need to control the markets around the world. So we made some more money and we lost the whole culture. It's too bad. Bill Clinton was basically just a continuation of George H.W. Bush. They were both liberal centrist internationalists. There's not much.
Liberal centrist internationalists. Interesting. So, I mean, the big difference between Bush and Clinton is that I think domestic policy, Clinton's a little more liberal than Bush. But Clinton was a moderate Democrat, especially by today's standards.
Not much of a difference between them. I guess Clinton was more of a degenerate in his personal life and had creative uses for cigars and things like that.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
But, I put him, I don't know, what's he? I guess he's sort of like a Mufasa in this. I mean, no, he's a Burger King. He's a clown, right? Bill Clinton's
Stop.
just a clown.
Stop. All right. I can kind of tolerate Jimmy Carter being down there. But FDR and Clinton in your lowest category? Come on, man. Come on.
Really be remembered for much of anything. Because he didn't even ask what
Clinton was a solid president. He was a good president. I think the further we get away from his presidency, probably the more effective he will be seen.
He stood for his own pleasure, basically. George W. Bush, poor guy. He actually, I do think, had some beliefs, but he just was not very effective, and he kind of got rolled by a lot of people, and so he was upright in his personal comportment, but in terms of the efficacy of his presidency, it was pretty weak stuff. He's a Mufasa. Barack Obama was effective. He really was effective. And
when he talks about liberal presidents being effective, what he means is they were effective in what they wanted, but I think they were completely wrong. So he's going to rank them low.
So in that sense, in a way, you want to give him credit for being a big tough guy, but because of how bad the effect of his policies were on the country, you got to make him Burger King. Then we get to Donald Trump, the best president of my lifetime. I haven't been around very long, but I'd call him a Leonidas. He's not a King Arthur. He's got some personal issues. He would be the first one to tell you that.
No, he would be the last one to tell you that, and that's one of his biggest personal issues, is that he doesn't recognize his own flaws. That's a serious character flaw when you can't recognize that you have defects. Contrast that with somebody like a George Washington, who in his farewell address says, though I'm unconscious of any errors that I may have made, intentional errors while president, I am too conscious of my own personal flaws not to recognize that I must have made many errors. He's basically saying, listen, I'm not perfect, and I know that I'm not perfect. So while I did my best and I can't think of anything that I did badly, I have no doubt that I screwed some stuff up because I'm not perfect. Contrast that with somebody like Donald Trump, who basically says, I make all the right decisions all the time. I am perfect. Even when you make right decisions, if you're incapable of recognizing your flaws, that's a big flaw in and of itself.
He did fight really hard. He fought for a good cause, and he lost. Like Leonidas, he was ultimately unsuccessful, but he put up a good fight. I think he inspired a lot of people.
At least and of course, this is before Trump was reelected. At least he didn't come out and say the election was stolen from Donald Trump.
I hope that, like Leonidas loses at the Battle of Thermopylae, but the Greeks win the war about a year later. Hopefully, Trump, they went after him. He fended them off, repeatedly. But then, in the end, ultimately, they finally got him. But hopefully he can inspire the rest of us conservatives to win the longer war. Then finally, Joe Biden. Joe Biden, is there another tier? Can I have a tier? I don't even want to give him credit for being Burger King. I think that the Burger King stands for much more.
I don't know. I've said this a few times now. How are we going to say that Woodrow Wilson was the worst president in American history, and then you're going to throw like 5 presidents below him on this list?
Than Joe Biden does. And I think the Burger King is in much greater control of his corporation than Joe Biden is in control of the country.
Come on, man.
So
Here's my thing with Joe Biden, and this is what is, I think, very sad about Joe Biden. Honestly, I think Joe Biden, had he been president 10 years earlier, would have been pretty effective. Now, you could agree or disagree with his policies, but I think a lot of the criticisms about Biden are just his lack of effectiveness, and he's really past his prime. And I think that's a fair assessment in hindsight. A lot of people were saying it even at the time he was running for election. So if go back and just watch video of him when he was vice president under Obama. It's like a completely different guy. And I feel pretty terrible for him because I think he was a good guy, and I think he just was taken advantage of in many ways. But I also don't think it's fair to judge a presidency, a year or even a few months after the person leaves office. So time will tell. But listen, obviously a very biased ranking there, and he didn't even cover a lot of the presidents, and I don't feel like he had a very deep grasp of many of these presidents. So I would encourage you to check out my tier list. I go into a little more detail with a lot of these presidents, and it's in the description below. That'll be a better way to talk about this stuff. And of course, we had a really in-depth conversation a couple years ago when me and Mr. Beat, who come from different perspectives on the political spectrum when we did a joint tier list of the presidents. It was like a 4-hour live stream that I think went really well and would give you a very balanced view of all of that. So check that out as well. Thanks for watching.